Hello. In our last video we covered prehistoric pottery, but I finished in the middle of the late Iron Age. Now before you all post furious comments telling me Roman Britain starts in 43 CE when Claudius rocked up, I know. But when you're looking at material culture rather than politics, the divisions are rarely clear-cut. There's a good deal of Roman influence on British pottery well before the conquest, and a good deal of British tradition lasting long after. In this video, we'll discuss how pottery changed through the period of Roman influence in Britain, and look at some of the most common types that occur in the West Midlands, and show you how to identify them. We need to start in the middle of the 1st century BCE, which is when you start to see wheel-made pots in elaborate forms. Pedestaled urns, beakers, ribbed urns, conical urns, little beakers with pronounced S-shaped curves, turning up in cemeteries in southeast England. This is the first appearance of so-called Belgic ware. The Belgae were a group resident in northern Gaul, and it seems either actively moving into southern Britain or at the very least very closely connected. This was occurring as or just before Rome was pushing into Gaul. And by the turn of the millennium, that Belgic style was starting to spread. There's a very small trade in imports of Gallo-Belgic ware before the conquest, and that's material actually made on the continent. But much more abundant was a burgeoning tradition of mostly grog-tempered, wheel-made vessels in a Belgic style, spreading at least as far as Buckinghamshire prior to the Roman conquest. How far west these got prior to 43 CE is still up for debate. There's one school of thought that says these pots spread west with the legions, and another that trade and connectivity brought them into the west of Britain before any military conquest. I've certainly seen small quantities of them in contexts which don't appear to have any of the other Romanised wares that did move with the legions. The grog temper can be tricky to recognise, especially at a glance. Since it's usually just ground up bits of recycled pots, grog can be hard to spot against the rest of the clay matrix. A fresh break really helps. Also, look for odd angles, small changes of colour within the fabric. These vessels tend to be quite fine-walled, surfaces are generally smooth and sometimes burnished, and they very often have sharp changes of angle, carinations, or a kind of corrugated effect, as if the potters are excited by the new potential of the wheel and are going a bit over the top with it. It didn't take long for a more Romanised style of pottery of local production to appear. This was probably in the first couple of decades, driven by the needs of the army. There's some evidence that legions brought along their own potters, and they're also importing finished vessels. The early levels of military settlements like Usk have lots of fine wares, more decorative and delicate ceramics, imported from elsewhere in the empire. But they also needed large quantities of everyday ceramics, storage jars, tankards, common or garden bowls and dishes. So the Roman army was taking advantage of existing local traditions and entering into contracts with local producers. And one of the ways you can see that happening is in the distribution. Two types of pot that are very common in the West Midlands are Severn Valley wares and Dorset black burnished wares. Both of these started off quite local. Both had their origins in pre-conquest traditions. Both supplied Roman military demands and the local civilian populations in the west of England and into South Wales. But then in the mid-2nd century, they suddenly started expanding their range drastically. Both Severn Valley ware and black burnished wares turn up supplying garrisons on Hadrian's Wall, and even deep into Scotland. Black burnished ware then became pretty ubiquitous all over much of England and Wales. The Severn Valley ware was more limited in its range, but still stretched the length of the western half of England and Wales. So with some types of pottery, military contracts were a springboard for a big expansion of a local industry into a major, nationally significant one. To enable this expansion of scale came a change in technology. Potters needed to be able to produce a large volume of pots of consistent forms and sizes. So kilns came into use, And with a kiln, you have more control of temperature and oxygen. You get a more even firing than the open firings we've discussed in the previous video on prehistoric pottery. The temperature rises much more steadily, so there's less risk of exploding pots as the remaining water is driven out. You can use finer fabrics with less need for added temper, and that means the resulting pots are more robust. And you can obtain a more consistent finish. You can also, to some extent, control the colour, allowing oxygen to flow freely to produce oxidised orange-coloured wares, or restricting oxygen to achieve a grey or a black reduced finish. Across most of Roman Britain, the abundant local potteries, many of which had a small distribution of maybe 20 or 30 kilometres, generally produced everyday vessels in reduced fabrics, collectively known as grey wares. They can be extremely tricky to tell apart, but in the West Midlands, our Severn Valley wares were predominantly oxidised, typically bright orange. They look like flower pots, to be honest. So how do you tell a bit of garden flower pot from a Roman sherd? Now bear in mind that Severn Valley wares were produced for about 350 years, so there's a lot of variety in that time. Very often, the core remained grey, so you have a sandwich effect, with orange surfaces and a grey core. But some vessels were oxidised all the way through. Often the surfaces will be soft, and you might get a smear of orange if you drag your finger over them. They're often quite micaceous, so you can hold them up to the light and see a faint sparkle from the mica flakes. And they were typically fairly plain, though you do often get raised horizontal bands, and you might sometimes see a lattice pattern on the exterior surface. Although the inclusions are fewer and finer than many of the prehistoric vessels we talked about in the last video, they do still occur. It's often a point of contention whether these are being added deliberately, or whether, probably more likely, they reflect imperfect processing of the clay, or both. Severn Valley wares vary widely, but they were produced in a very broad area. Key production sites were in Somerset, in Gloucester, in Malvern, Wroxeter and Perry Barr, so some variation is down to the local clays. But there were chronological trends too. Severn Valley wares from the 1st and early 2nd century often contain grog and small voids where organic remains have burnt out during firing. Wares of Malvernian production will sometimes have the odd chunk of Malvern rock. From the 2nd to the 4th century, some of the Gloucestershire wares contain limestone. But perhaps a more reliable way of dating Severn Valley wares is in the form. And the trends hold true across many local industries up and down the country, even given local variation. There are some long-lived jar forms that change remarkably little from the mid-1st century to the late 4th. But there's an overall trend. The rims of the jars went from being simply everted and outturned like this, to being hooked over and markedly angular, and creating a real collar. Tankards were a popular Severn Valley form. These look like large mugs, but there's some uncertainty over their function. Possibly they were used for communal drinking, emerging out of the tradition of Iron Age wooden tankards with metal fittings. But there's some suggestion they may have been measures. Some could be huge, holding up to a couple of litres by volume. Their profile got more flared over time. Early examples had pretty straight sides, but by the 4th century, they were bell-shaped. In the West Midlands, often 70% of the pottery on Roman sites are Severn Valley wares, and likewise across the country, local grey wares tend to be the majority. But those black burnished wares were numerous too. Their distribution was confined to the southwest till roughly 120 CE, and then expanded. It waxed and waned over time, and the other complicating factor is that there were a lot of local copies, especially once distribution became limited amid the political and economic turmoil of the late 4th century. But where they occur, they're a really key dating tool, because their forms also changed over time. The Dorset black burnished wares developed directly out of an Iron Age tradition. Unusually among Roman wares, they were still open-fired rather than made in a kiln. They therefore have denser inclusions, usually well-sorted rounded grains of quartz under 1 mm. The clean break resembles a mass of fish eggs. The surfaces are highly burnished, achieved by polishing the leather-hard pot. But the jars and bowls often have rough bands left around the middle of the vessel, and these can be crisscrossed by lattice patterns. Early examples have acute lattices, and then they splay over time, passing the right angle in the early 3rd century and becoming very obtuse by the late 3rd and 4th. Some black burnished wares continued right into the 5th century, but by that stage they don't seem to travel far. Another good indicator is if you have these types of bowls with a flanged rim. Yeah. A little flange there, typically 3rd or 4th century. Probably the best known type of Roman pottery in Britain is also, luckily, one of the most distinctive, Samian ware. It's a category that covers a group of fine tablewares that were mostly imported. The vast majority of Samian in Britain came from Gaul, and it spanned the mid-1st century through to the early 3rd century CE. Early on, it was mostly coming from South Gaul, then Central and Eastern Gaulish factories took over. The Worcestershire Ceramics website has photos and detailed descriptions of the different fabrics, but they're often difficult to tell apart, especially by eye. What all of them have in common is a glossy red slip, sometimes shading to brown or orange. It covered the whole vessel inside and out. The fabric is typically pinkish, sometimes with little white specks, tiny limestone inclusions. The broken edges and the surfaces are very smooth. Some vessels had moulded relief decoration, animals, birds, hunting scenes, and even occasionally some X-rated scenes. Some Samian wares were stamped with the name of the potter, and there's a database you can use to look these up. This bears the stamp of a potter named Cedillus. He was working in central Gaul between about 110 and 130 CE. There's a perception that Samian wares were high status. They were certainly valued and prized possessions. You can see that from the high numbers of vessels you find which are being painstakingly repaired. But finding Samian doesn't mean you have a high status site. It would have been within the reach of people of fairly moderate means, and it turns up on very modest farmsteads as well as the fancy villas. Alongside the Samian wares were small quantities of other imports, from the Rhineland, from North Africa, from the Eastern Mediterranean. These were usually fine-walled, colour-coated wares, and these are mostly late 1st to mid-2nd century. In the mid-3rd century, the decline in imports of Samian ware from Gaul and those other fine wares was counterbalanced by the emergence of British manufacturers producing colour-coated and painted parchment wares, imitating Samian forms. The 3 main industries whose products got to the West Midlands were Oxfordshire, the Nene Valley, and the New Forest colour-coated wares. Between and within them, there's a lot of variety. Some basic things to look out for are a fine fabric with relatively few visible inclusions. They can be either white or pink-orange, and they were covered with a slip that ranges from orange through red to dark brown or this kind of dark greenish brown. Some examples have additional white painted decoration on top of the slip. There are 2 more types of specialist vessel particular to the Roman period that are worth mentioning because they're pretty robust and tend to survive quite well. Amphorae were used to transport Mediterranean products like wine and olive oil. These were often huge containers. The most common type found in Britain is the Dressel 20. These were made in Spain from the 1st to the 3rd centuries CE and carried an average of around 60 to 65 litres of oil. They had a pointed base and 2 thick handles at the top. Typically, the fabric had a light grey core and buff to yellow surface, sometimes with a pale brown or pink tinge. It's quite coarse and gritty with quartz inclusions and some mica. But the main clue is its sheer size. If you've got something that you're thinking, looks like pot, curvature is right, but it's massive, then you might have an amphora. Another type of pot brought in by Roman ways of life is the mortarium. These were bowls for grinding and mixing, and this is where we get the concept of the modern pestle and mortar from. They had a dished internal surface with no angles. They had thick, wide flanges on the rim, and a spout, often with a groove or channel for pouring out the contents. The key identifying feature is the presence of grits on the inner surface. These were coarse stone, flint, quartz, red sandstone, ironstone, to provide a gritty, textured surface. On well-worn examples, they may almost be worn flush to the surface. But you can tell these from pots with coarse inclusions because the mortaria grits only occur on the inner surface, pressed into the wet pot. They're not inclusions in the clay. You don't see them in the broken edge. Mortaria was specialist vessels produced by a few key industries, and the fabrics tend to be very fine. In the West Midlands, the fabrics are most often white or buff-coloured, products of the industries at Verulamium, St Albans from the 1st century, Oxfordshire and Manchester Hartshill from the 2nd to 4th centuries. But you do sometimes get orange oxidised examples in Severn Valley wares. Some of the Manchester Hartshill wares are stamped with the names of the potters, a practice that was quite common on imported fine wares like Samian, but less common on vessels made in Britain. And they're lovely because we can trace the networks and practices of individuals. They're some of the only named craftspeople from Roman Britain, and it's remarkable to be able to hold something 1800 years old and know the name of the person that made it. Just like the beginning of the period, the ceramic signature of the end of the Roman period is fuzzy. Officially, Roman rule over the province ended 409 to 410 CE, but things had become increasingly unstable for some years beforehand. From the late 3rd century, there was a decline in the prosperity of towns, and a lot of the wealth and power seems to have shifted to large villas and country estates. These did very well through the early years of the 4th century. Whether you think that is a sign of stability and good governance, or a symptom of increasing wealth inequality and dysfunction, rather depends on your approach. But either way, from the later 360s, there were a series of chaotic episodes, like the Great Barbarian Conspiracy of 367-8, and these had an effect on the ability to produce and trade pottery up and down the country. Many industries seized, others contracted. In South Worcestershire, you get local copies of black burnished wares, which may very well span the late 4th and early 5th century. Certainly there was still Roman-style pottery being produced into the middle of the 5th century, and many of the late Roman power centres and estates maintained their control long after the legions had left. That completes our introduction to Roman pottery. If you'd like to dive deeper, there are some links coming up shortly. As well as the Worcestershire Ceramics website, I strongly recommend Paul Tyer's Potsherd website, which has links to the online version of this, the National Roman Fabric Reference Collection. Next up, we'll be looking at medieval and then post-medieval pottery. Hope to see you there.